She ruled 1,000 star systems, commanding fleets that blotted out the sun. Yet her greatest shock came not from an interstellar war, but from the quiet, unassuming human husband she thought she knew. When assassins breached the royal chambers, the galaxy learned why humanity never boasts about its monsters. Queen Catherine of the Altarian sovereignty didn't marry for love. In the high-stakes theater of galactic politics, matrimony was merely another treaty, a contract signed in ink and sealed with public pageantry. Her empire was vast, possessing unmatched technological marvels and fleets of dreadnoughts that kept the outer rim in line. However, her core worlds were dying. A devastating blight had ravaged the Altarian agricultural sectors, and only the United Earth Directorate possessed the terraforming and botanical expertise required to reverse the famine. The terms of the Orion Accords were straightforward. Earth would provide the agricultural technology and personnel to save the Altarian people. In return, Earth would receive exclusive trillium mining rights in the sovereignty's outer asteroid belts. To solidify this unprecedented alliance, Secretary Thomas Wade of Earth proposed a marriage between Queen Catherine and a human representative. Catherine had braced herself for a towering, boisterous human general or a cunning, sharp-tongued politician. Instead, they sent Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan was introduced as a Class 3 agricultural attaché. He was a man of entirely average height, with graying hair at his temples and a quiet, almost deferential demeanor. When he first arrived at the Obsidian Palace, he carried his own luggage, a faux pas that sent ripples of amused contempt through the Altarian nobility. His hands were calloused, not from holding a sword or a plasma rifle, but from years of working in soil. Is this the best Earth has to offer? Lord Chancellor Harrison had sneered during the welcoming banquet, intentionally speaking loudly enough for the human delegation to hear. A dirt farmer to stand beside the sovereign of the stars. Jonathan had merely smiled, taking a sip of his water. The dirt is where life begins. Chancellor, he had replied mildly, I'm just here to make sure it grows. In the 3 years following their wedding, Catherine found herself unexpectedly charmed by her human husband. Altarian culture was one of fierce, martial pride, where disputes were settled in honor duels and boastful tales of conquest were the currency of the court. Jonathan was a stark contrast to the aggressive posturing of her dukes and lords. He spent his days in the royal botanical gardens, meticulously cultivating heirloom tomatoes and repairing a heavily outdated human machine he called a 1967 Mustang. He was endlessly patient, soft-spoken, and gentle. When the court whispered about his cowardice, noting how he had politely declined 3 separate challenges to non-lethal duels by the brash Duke, Reginald Catherine felt a protective flare of anger. She knew Jonathan was not a warrior. He had flinched during the New Year's plasma cannon salute. He went to bed early. He enjoyed reading worn, physical books by the fireplace. You do not have to endure their insults, Jonathan, Catherine told him one evening, watching him carefully prune a bonsai tree in their private quarters. I can have Reginald exiled to the ice mines for his disrespect. Jonathan paused, setting down his small shears. He looked at her with warm, crinkling eyes. Let him talk, Catherine. Words only have the power you give them. Besides, I have no interest in fighting. I've seen enough conflict in history books. Peace is a fragile, beautiful thing. I'd rather spend my time nurturing this tree than nursing a bruised ego. Catherine had touched his cheek, marveling at his innocence. In a galaxy filled with predators, Jonathan Hayes was a rare, harmless herbivore. She swore to herself that she would use every dreadnought in her fleet to protect his gentle soul from the harsh realities of her universe. She truly believed that without her protection, her modest husband would not survive a single day in the cutthroat political landscape of Altair. She could not have been more wrong. The Centennial Solstice Gala was intended to be the crowning achievement of Catherine's reign. Held in the grand atrium of the Obsidian Spire, the event brought together thousands of diplomats, planetary governors, and military leaders. Crystal chandeliers floated on anti-gravity repulsors, casting fractured rainbows across the marble floors. Ambassadors from a dozen star systems mingled with Altarian elite. Jonathan stood dutifully by Catherine's side, dressed in a simple tailored black tuxedo that contrasted sharply with the vibrant jewel-encrusted armor worn by the Altarian nobility. He was nursing a glass of sparkling cider, politely nodding as Lord Commander Griffin regaled them with a loud, overly embellished story of a pirate skirmish in the Sigma Quadrant. And then with one sweep of my thermal blade, I cleaved the scoundrel's console in half. Griffin boasted, laughing raucously. He clapped Jonathan on the shoulder hard enough to make the human stumble slightly. Of course you wouldn't know much about the thrill of combat, would you? Hayes preferring your little gardens to the battlefield. I find gardens are much better at sustaining life, Commander, Jonathan replied with a polite, practiced smile. Catherine was about to reprimand Griffin for his insolence when the atrium plunged into absolute darkness. The floating chandeliers crashed to the floor, shattering into millions of razor-sharp shards. The hum of the palace's energy shielding ground to a sickening halt. A collective gasp echoed through the massive hall, followed instantly by the deafening roar of breaching charges. The massive adamantium doors of the atrium blew inward, crushing 3 of Catherine's elite royal guards beneath tons of twisted metal. Through the smoke and falling debris marched a specialized mercenary strike force. They wore the matte black sensor-absorbing armor of the Void Raiders, a ruthless separatist faction funded by political dissidents who opposed the Earth-Altair alliance. At their head was Malachi, a towering warlord with cybernetic optics and a heavy plasma repeater mounted to his right arm. Secure the perimeter. Kill the guards. Take the Queen alive. Malachi's voice boomed through an external amplifier, shaking the remaining glass in the hall. Panic erupted. The Altarian nobility, so boastful of their martial prowess, found themselves completely unarmed and unprepared. Lord Commander Griffin drew a ceremonial dagger, but a mercenary ruthlessly gunned him down before he could take a single step, blowing a hole through his jewel-encrusted chest plate. Screams filled the air as the royal guard, severely outnumbered and outgunned, were systematically slaughtered. Plasma fire illuminated the dark atrium in terrifying flashes of neon blue and searing red. Catherine froze her mind, struggling to process the sudden overwhelming violence. A pair of heavy-armored mercenaries broke through the defensive line, raising their rifles directly at her. She braced for the end. Suddenly, a hand grabbed the collar of her royal gown and yanked her violently backward behind a massive marble pillar. It was Jonathan, but the man looking at her was not the gentle botanist she had married. The polite, crinkling warmth in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, predatory calculation that sent a chill down Catherine's spine. His posture had shifted. The slight slouch of a modest diplomat vanished. He stood perfectly balanced, his muscles coiled with lethal tension. "Stay here. Do not move," Jonathan ordered. His voice was no longer soft. It was a low, gravelly command that brooked no argument. "Jonathan, they have heavy plasma repeaters. You can't—" Before she could finish, a mercenary rounded the pillar rifle raised. What happened next defied everything Catherine knew about human biology. Jonathan didn't cower. He didn't scream. He exploded into motion. With terrifying speed, Jonathan stepped inside the mercenary's guard. His left hand slapped the barrel of the plasma rifle upward, just as it fired, sending a scorch mark across the ceiling. Simultaneously, his right hand formed a rigid strike, driving directly into the soft joint of the mercenary's neck armor. There was a sickening crack. As the massive soldier slumped forward, Jonathan didn't hesitate. He stripped the combat knife from the falling man's chest rig, caught the dropping plasma rifle by the grip, and spun. 2 more mercenaries approached from the flank. Jonathan fired blindly with one hand, accurately putting 2 plasma bolts through the visor of the first attacker. The second mercenary lunged with a shock baton. Jonathan stepped into the attack, parrying the baton with the rifle barrel, and drove the stolen combat knife upward, sliding it flawlessly between the armored plates under the attacker's armpit. A kill shot, requiring anatomical knowledge no dirt farmer should possess. 3 elite, heavily armored killers lay dead on the marble floor. It had taken Jonathan Hayes exactly 4 seconds. He didn't pause to boast. He didn't yell a battle cry. He moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. He checked the charge on the plasma rifle, stripped a bandolier of concussive grenades from a corpse, and looked back at Catherine. 3 minutes. Jonathan said, his voice flat, devoid of adrenaline or fear. The palace's secondary backup generators will boot in exactly 3 minutes. I will clear a path to the royal bunker. Keep your head down, Catherine. Jonathan. Catherine breathed, her eyes wide with shock. Who are you? He ejected a spent thermal cartridge from the rifle, slamming a fresh one home with a sharp clack. I'm your husband, he said coldly. And until 3 years ago, I was the commander of Earth's Orbital Drop Shock Division Task Force Reaper. Now stay behind me. The modest man who loved pruning bonsai trees stepped out from behind the pillar, raising the heavy rifle to his shoulder, and walked straight into the chaos. The grand corridors of the obsidian spire, once a testament to Alterian architectural brilliance, had become a darkened labyrinth of shattered marble and flickering emergency lumen strips. The air was thick with the acrid stench of ozone-pulverized stone and the searing heat of discharged plasma. Through this chaotic environment, Jonathan Hayes moved with a terrifying mechanical grace. Queen Catherine followed closely behind him. Her royal heels discarded her grand gown, torn at the hem to allow for movement. Her mind was a whirlwind of absolute disbelief. The man leading her through the war zone was a complete stranger. Gone was the gentle botanist who coaxed life from fragile seeds. In his place stood an apex predator, stripped of all pretense, operating on a level of lethal efficiency that the Alterian Military Academy had never even conceptualized. As they approached the intersection of the Grand Promenade, the heavy metallic stomps of Void Raider boots echoed from the adjacent hall. Jonathan held up a single clenched fist. Catherine immediately stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jonathan did not peek around the corner like a holovid action hero. Instead, he employed a foundational Earth military tactic known as slicing the pie, taking slow measured steps backward and laterally to incrementally expose his line of sight to the new corridor while remaining largely in cover. 3 targets, heavy armor, spread formation. Jonathan whispered, his voice an icy whisper, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. He was analyzing the threat utilizing a cognitive framework rooted in ancient human military history, Colonel John Boyd's OODA loop, Observe, Orient, Decide Act. While the Alterian mercenaries were still relying on aggressive posturing and intimidation, Jonathan was processing battlefield geometry at a speed that rendered them practically static. He drew a cylindrical concussive device from his stolen bandolier, pulled the arming pin, and bounced it perfectly off the opposite marble wall. The device skipped off the stone and disappeared around the corner. Eyes closed, mouth open, Jonathan commanded, dropping to one knee. Catherine obeyed instantly, A devastating shockwave ripped through the corridor, accompanied by a flash of blinding white light and a concussive boom that rattled Catherine's teeth. Before the sound had even finished echoing, Jonathan was already moving. He swept around the corner, adopting a compact, weapon retention posture that Earth tacticians called the center axis relock. It kept his stolen plasma rifle tight to his chest, allowing for rapid sweeping target acquisition in the claustrophobic space. Thwack, thwack, thwack. 3 suppressed bursts of plasma. 3 heavy bodies crashing to the floor in perfect unison. There was no boastful shouting, no exchanging of honorable dialogue. It was an execution. Catherine stepped around the corner, her breath catching in her throat. The 3 Void Raiders were completely incapacitated, their heavy composite armor, bypassed by shots, fired precisely into the unarmored joints at the throat and underarms. It was an anatomical dismantling. "They boast of their armor," Jonathan muttered, checking his weapon's thermal gauge. "But armor restricts movement. It makes them arrogant. Arrogance is a tactical vulnerability." He stepped over the bodies scavenging a high-capacity energy cell and a short-barreled scattergun from the squad leader. As he worked, the mercenaries' comms link sparked to life, projecting the furious voice of the warlord Malachi. "Squad 7 report. Did you secure the Eastern Wing, Squad 7? Jonathan picked up the comms earpiece, holding it close to his mouth. "Squad 7 is permanently offline, Malachi." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the frequency. "Who is this? Where is the Royal Guard? I have 20 men locking down that sector." "You had 20 men." Jonathan corrected his voice, carrying the chilling calm of a deep winter freeze. "Now you have 12. In exactly 90 seconds you will have 0. Retreat is no longer an authorized option for you." He crushed the earpiece beneath his heel. Catherine stared at the broad shoulders of her husband. "Jonathan, Earth told us you were a Class 3 agricultural attaché. They said you were a farmer." Jonathan paused, his eyes, scanning the ceiling for automated defense turrets. "I am a farmer, Catherine. For 20 years I planted operatives in hostile territories and harvested the results. Task Force Reaper wasn't an army. It was an erasure protocol. When diplomacy failed, when standard military intervention was deemed too noisy, Earth Command sent us. We didn't fight wars. We ended them before the public ever knew they started. But the gardens, the gentle way you speak, your refusal to fight Reginald." Jonathan looked back at her, the faintest hint of sorrow cutting through his cold exterior. "When you spend a lifetime taking lives in the dark, you desperately crave the act of creating life in the light. I asked for this assignment. Earth Command owed me a retirement. They knew Altair needed agricultural technology, and they knew your political climate was incredibly volatile. They sent me as a diplomatic gift, but also as a fail-safe. If the Queen was ever threatened, the dirt farmer would ensure her survival." A terrifying realization washed over Catherine. Earth had not sent a weak diplomat out of disrespect. They had sent their most dangerous, lethal instrument of death disguised as a lamb, because humanity viewed actual warfare as a tedious chore to be avoided. They didn't boast like the Altarians, because they had nothing to prove. They had perfected the art of violence so thoroughly that it terrified even them. "Move!" Jonathan instructed his combat focus, snapping back into place. "The secondary generators kick in soon. We need to reach the royal bunker before Malachi realizes he's being hunted by a single hostile." As they descended the spiral staircase toward the subterranean levels, the true horror of human military philosophy was laid bare before the alien queen. Jonathan didn't fight with honor. He fought with an industrialized, ruthless pragmatism. He used the environment as a weapon. He utilized psychological warfare, shooting out the few remaining emergency lights to plunge the corridors into absolute blackness, knowing the alien mercenaries relied heavily on their visual spectrum. He moved like a phantom. Time and time again, Catherine watched as heavily armed squads of Void Raiders were systematically dismantled. Jonathan would appear from the shadows, utilizing a combination of suppressed plasma fire and devastating close-quarters strikes derived from Earth's ancient Krav Maga and Fairbairn Sykes methodologies. He broke limbs to disable severed synthetic nerve cables and used the mercenaries' own bulk against them. He was a force of nature, a silent storm tearing through the ranks of the galaxy's most feared criminal syndicate. By the time they reached the heavily reinforced adamantium doors of the royal bunker, the once boastful mercenary force had been reduced to a frantic, terrified handful of survivors. The comms channels were no longer filled with arrogant commands, but with panicked screams and garbled pleas for backup that would never arrive. The predator had become the prey. The royal bunker was a massive subterranean vault designed to withstand orbital bombardment. The heavy adamantium doors were currently sealed, but standing in front of the access terminal was Malachi. The towering warlord had surrounded himself with his last 6 elite enforcers. Malachi was a terrifying sight, clad in heavy, mechanized dread armor, his cybernetic optics glowing a menacing crimson in the dim light. A heavy rotary plasma cannon was mounted to his right forearm. Jonathan pulled Catherine behind the cover of a massive support pillar just outside the bunker's antechamber. He checked his stolen rifle. The thermal cartridge was completely depleted. He discarded the useless weapon, leaving him with only the scavenged scattergun and his combat knife. "He's heavily augmented," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at Malachi's imposing frame. "His armor is rated against anti-vehicle munitions. You cannot pierce it with small arms, Jonathan." Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He was observing. He analyzed the heavy hydraulic servos on Malachi's knees, the exposed cooling vents on the rotary cannon, and the specific frequency of his cybernetic optics. "Every machine has a thermal limit," Jonathan finally said, pulling a specialized tactical strobe from his pocket, a heavy-duty human design. "And every predator goes blind if you stare into the sun. Stay here." Before she could protest, Jonathan stepped out from the cover of the pillar, walking completely unarmed into the open antechamber. "Malachi." Jonathan called out, his voice echoing off the metallic walls. The warlord spun around the rotary cannon, whining as it spun up to lethal speeds. The 6 remaining mercenaries raised their weapons, locking their targeting lasers onto Jonathan's chest. "The Queen's pet human." Malachi sneered, his mechanical voice grating like grinding gears. "I have monitored the comms. You are the one who slaughtered my men. A neat parlor trick human. But parlor tricks do not pierce dread armor." "I don't need to pierce your armor," Jonathan replied calmly, continuing his slow, measured walk toward the firing squad. "I just need to cook the meat inside it." "Open fire!" Malachi roared. In a fraction of a second, Jonathan threw the tactical strobe high into the air. It wasn't a standard Altarian flare. It was a military-grade magnesium phosphorus flashbang designed to overwhelm sensory equipment. As it detonated with a blinding, incandescent fury, Jonathan simultaneously kicked a heavy metallic debris panel on the floor, sending a cloud of pulverized marble dust into the air. Malachi's cybernetic optics, designed to amplify light in dark environments, instantly overloaded. The warlord screamed as the feedback loop fried his optical nerves, forcing his armor's automated safety protocols to trigger a hard visual reset. The 6 mercenaries, temporarily blinded and disoriented, fired their weapons wildly into the dust cloud. Jonathan was already underneath their firing arcs. He didn't aim for their armored chests. He swept low, discharging the scattergun at point-blank range into the unprotected ankles and knee joints of the mercenaries. The heavy kinetic impact shattered their mobility. As they collapsed, shrieking in pain, Jonathan wove through their falling bodies with terrifying speed. He didn't waste time finishing them. They were no longer a tactical threat. His eyes were locked on Malachi. The warlord swung his massive rotary cannon blindly, the heavy weapon tearing chunks of stone from the walls. Jonathan slid under the sweeping arc of the weapon, coming up directly inside Malachi's guard. With precise mechanical ruthlessness, Jonathan drove his combat knife not into the armor, but directly into the primary cooling vent of the rotary cannon. The high-carbon steel blade shattered the delicate thermal regulators. Malachi roared in fury, attempting to backhand the human. Jonathan ducked the clumsy strike, drawing a salvaged high-capacity energy cell from his belt. He slammed the unstable overcharged cell directly into the jammed cooling vent of the cannon, twisting it violently to lock it in place, and kicked hard against Malachi's knee actuator to create distance. "Thermal runaway," Jonathan stated coldly, diving behind a reinforced barricade. Malachi looked down at his arm. The energy cell was glowing a furious, blinding white, the heat instantly melting the surrounding armor plating. The warlord only had a second to realize what the human had done. No. The explosion was contained, but devastating. The rotary cannon and the overloaded energy cell detonated simultaneously, ripping Malachi's mechanized arm entirely off and sending the massive warlord crashing into the adamantium doors. The concussive force knocked the remaining mercenaries unconscious. Silence descended upon the antechamber, broken only by the hiss of melting metal and the groans of the incapacitated warlord. Exactly 3 seconds later, the deep, rumbling hum of the palace's secondary backup generators echoed through the floors. The emergency shutters retracted, and the bright, opulent lighting of the obsidian spire flooded back into the corridors. Catherine stepped out from behind the pillar, her eyes wide as she surveyed the carnage. The invulnerable warlord was a broken, defeated mess on the floor. His elite strike force was completely neutralized, and standing amidst the destruction, brushing marble dust off his tailored black tuxedo, was her unassuming husband. The adamantium doors of the bunker hissed open. The surviving Altarian nobility, including a terrified Chancellor Harrison, tentatively stepped out. They expected to find the Void Raiders waiting to execute them. Instead, they found a graveyard of heavily armored mercenaries, all systematically dismantled by the quiet man they had mocked just hours before. Chancellor Harrison stared at Jonathan, his jaw slack, all his previous arrogance completely evaporated. He looked at the smoking wreckage of Malachi, then back at the modest human. Jonathan calmly adjusted his cuffs, his demeanor shifting instantly back to the polite, soft-spoken diplomat they all knew. He offered a slight, courteous bow to the stunned Chancellor. "I apologize for the mess, Chancellor," Jonathan said mildly. "It seems we had an unexpected pest problem, but the garden is clear now." He turned away from the trembling nobles and walked over to Catherine. The cold, predatory killer was gone, replaced once again by the warm, crinkling eyes of the man she loved. He gently took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping softly around hers. "Are you unharmed?" "Catherine?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. "I am," she breathed, gripping his hand tightly. She looked at the nobility watching as their expressions of disdain transformed into absolute, unadulterated terror and respect. Earth hadn't sent a farmer because they were weak. They sent a farmer because their soldiers were too terrifying to unleash upon the stars. "Jonathan." Catherine smiled, a fierce, proud warmth blooming in her chest. "Tomorrow I believe I would like you to teach me about your 1967 Mustang. And then, perhaps you can show my generals how to properly clear a room." Jonathan chuckled softly, leading his queen through the shattered halls. "I'd love to, my dear. But first we need to check on the bonsai trees. I suspect the concussive blasts may have disrupted their soil." The Altarian sovereignty never questioned humanity's strength again. They learned the most vital lesson of the cosmos: beware the quiet ones, for they have nothing to prove and absolutely everything to protect. If you enjoyed this HFY sci-fi story of the ultimate hidden badass, make sure to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more epic tales. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new release, and leave a comment below telling us your favorite tactical move Jonathan made. Your support helps us bring more incredible universe-spanning stories to life.